You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 34, Ella West. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Ashley Thomas.
Each week on Gene-ology, we dig through the back catalog of Gene Roddenberry's early work and introduce those scripts and stories to a new audience looking for signs of the kind of socially relevant messages Gene was known for weaving into his most famous TV creation, Star Trek.
Each week?
Well, okay, good point. We've had a little bit of downtime recently. Norm is taking some personal time, and we've had to regroup just a little bit to try to get back on schedule. But this also gives an opportunity for some fresh perspectives on this classic material. So, Ashley, introduce yourself to everyone listening and tell us where we might have seen or heard your work before.
Sure. I'm Ashley Thomas. I go about online known as the Nerdy Blogger. Few places you might have read or heard me. You could read my words on fangirlish.com, where I write about film and television, but mostly Star Trek. You could hear my words being read on the Sci-Fi 5 podcast, where I was one of the contributing writers to that show. So if you like sci-fi history, you may have heard my words there. You also may have heard me on a few different podcasts. I am a co-host on 3 different shows. One is all about Marvel. It's called Podcast 616, which is podcast-616. You could have heard me talk about Star Trek, more specifically Discovery and Strange New Worlds, on my Star Trek show called We Are Starfleet. Both of those shows are part of the Film Stories podcasting network. You can check us out at filmstories.co.uk. Also may have heard me on the Video Store podcast, where I am one of a few different rotating hosts in a round-robin style, where we make video store-style recommendations based around a theme or an actor or director or genre, that sort of thing. So those are a few places that you might have heard me.
I will be back with trivia in a moment. But first, here is how you can reach us.
Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, let's pour ourselves a tall glass of trivia, Earl.
All right, thank you, Ashley. Everybody, welcome to 1958. Ella West is the last of Gene Roddenberry's contributions to the first season of Have Gun Will Travel, and it's also the end of a solid month of episodes he wrote. Originally aired on January 4th, 1958, this was the last new episode of Have Gun to bear Gene's name in the credits until October of that year. But Gene was staying busy. Gene's first season Have Gun episodes appeared alongside episodes of another Western, Boots and Saddles, that he wrote, so he wasn't confining himself to working on just one show. In the months ahead in 1958, Gene wrote several episodes of Jefferson Drum, a Western that concerned itself with an Old West journalist rather than a gunslinger. And, of course, as we already covered in episode 26 of this podcast, the Harbor Command episode, The Psychiatrist. There was also another series pitch, The Centurions, which, much like the languishing Sam Houston series concept, never made it in front of the cameras. We'll cover some of this work at a later date, but currently our podcast plans are to stick with Have Gun Will Travel through the end of 1959, because 1960 marks a clean break where Gene didn't do much writing for Paladin for an entire year. He had other projects going on. And, of course, stick around to learn about that. The guest stars this week include Norma Crane as Ella. Norma was one of those faces who could be seen all over TV and a few movies at this point in the history of American television. She also guest starred on The Inner Sanctum, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Untouchables, The Fugitive, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Night Gallery, Adam 12, and many others, but to many of us, her place in film history is cemented with her starring role as Goldie in the 1971 film adaptation of Fiddler on the Roof. She was the second wife of Saturday Night Live writer Herb Sargent. Norma died of breast cancer in 1973, and as a matter of interest, a close friend of hers covered Norma's medical and funeral expenses, a close friend who happened to be actress Natalie Wood. As Tracy Calvert, we have journeyman stage, TV, and film actor William Swan, who was a fixture on TV of this era without ever landing his own series regular role. Viewers who saw his guest starring turn on Have Gun Will Travel in real time might also have seen him in episodes of Mike Hammer, Father Knows Best, Perry Mason, Harbor Command, One Step Beyond, The Twilight Zone, The Streets of San Francisco, Barnaby Jones, and very small roles in such films as Magnum Force, The Parallax View, and a final appearance in 2009's Winter of Frozen Dreams. We lost William Swan in 2019. As this closes out our Season 1 coverage of Gene's writing for Have Gun Will Travel, it's worth noting that starting in June 1958, Have Gun went into a 12-week rerun period, and of those 12 shows repeated, 3 of them, 1/4 of the summer reruns, were Gene's episodes, starting with The Great Mojave Chase on June 28, 1958, Ella West again on August 23rd, and a repeat of The Yuma Treasure on August 30th, 1958. Act 1. Abilene, Texas. Paladin, not dressed in black for once, steps off a stagecoach and immediately spots a sign advertising Tomahawk Carter's Wild West Show. Top wages paid for expert horsemen, rifle marksmen, genuine Indians, bronc busters, and handymen. Paladin might just qualify in many of these job descriptions, so he steps through the door and almost immediately the sounds of gunfire are heard. The wait staff run for their lives. But who is doing the shooting? Meet Miss Ella West, brash, boisterous, maybe just a little bit dangerous, and not taking too kindly to the first man who tells her to keep her gun in its holster. She even pokes fun at Paladin for his San Francisco finery. As she puts it herself, she's no lady, and every moment she spends in a public space, she sees it as her duty to put the men around her in their place. That includes young Tracy Calvert. There's obviously some tension in the air there. Tomahawk Carter himself arrives, breaks up the scene, and buys everyone a round of drinks. And when he sets eyes on Paladin, who is amused about the whole scene he just saw unfold, Carter recognizes him on sight, introduces Tracy to Paladin, and pulls him aside for a sidebar over drinks. Carter's got a job for Paladin if he happens to be looking for work while he's in Abilene. Try to tame Ella West. She's been working as part of Carter's show for only a month, but she's racked up quite a few bills for damage, bills that Carter winds up having to cover. When Paladin asks Tracy how long he's known Ella, Tracy doesn't seem to want to have that discussion, and excuses himself because, there's work to be done. Paladin offers to take on this daunting task, but his bill is 10% of the proceeds from this entire season of Tomahawk's show, but that's only if he manages to complete the job. Tomahawk formally introduces Paladin to Ella West and tells her why Paladin is there. Her reaction is immediate and furious. "You ain't gonna learn me nothin'." To which Paladin replies, "That's correct. I'm going to teach you. You'll do the learning." Paladin pours himself a drink. Ella shoots the glass out of his hand. When she tries to hit him, he flips her over without even getting up out of his chair. Ella finally has a seat on the couch. Let the lessons begin. Act 2. Paladin makes some progress on getting Ella to calm down and just talk about things like her less-than-ideal upbringing, or the fact that she's known Tracy Calvert since they were both kids. When they were both in their late teens, Tracy's family moved away, and it felt like Ella was being abandoned. Young Ella would have done anything to get out of her home situation at that age, but she couldn't, and she has held that against Tracy Calvert ever since. And she admits that she's not happy with what her life looks like now, either, and begs Paladin to help her escape it. He can't even meet her gaze as he tells her, "You're dirty. Find some man who wants the smell of the stables." The rootinest, tootinest gal in Abilene runs out of the room in tears. Later in the saloon, the sounds of gunfire are heard, and the wait staff run for their lives. The manager tells Tracy he better get in there and bring Ella to heel. Breed, the resident tough guy of Tomahawk Crotter's show, gets aggressive when Tracy tries to cut Ella down to size and calm her down. At first, Ella yells in Tracy's face, but then she sits and quietly asks him to leave her alone. Incensed, Breed tells Ella to give Tracy his gun. There's going to be a duel. A voice from the doorway says that won't be necessary. It's Paladin, decked out in all black for the first time since he came to Abilene, gun on his hip. Ella tells Breed to stand down, but no dice. He has accepted Paladin's challenge. Paladin tells the bartender to pour 5 whiskeys and repeats to Breed what he promised Tomahawk Crotter. The goal was to avoid any bloodshed. Breed smugly reaches for the first glass of whiskey when Paladin proceeds to shoot all 5 glasses in rapid succession, just so Breed understands who it is he's about to duel with. But before that can happen, Carter walks in and hands Breed his walking papers. With that out of the way, Paladin tells Ella to meet him promptly in the morning to continue her lessons. Act 3. Back in his room, a while after the incident with Breed, Paladin is just hanging up his gun when Ella knocks at the door, wearing a dress instead of her usual cowgirl clothes. She even admits to having taken a bath. She's been thinking about something Tracy said to her during the confrontation with Breed. In her words, "If I ain't a woman, I ain't nothing." Sitting on the sofa together, Ella and Paladin are close enough to kiss until Paladin stands up. He praises Ella not just on her appearance, but on her ability to make the changes in her life she wants to make. He knows that deep down it's always been about Ella trying to impress Tracy Calvert. Noticing the chess piece design on Paladin's holster, Ella figures that Paladin is holding himself to the same code of honor as the knights of old. Paladin does give her one kiss, but that's all he is allowing her, or himself. Later, Ella is setting the table when Tracy comes into Paladin's room, something Paladin apparently told him to do. Paladin does show up a little bit late and says he's got to leave town. When Ella says she's going with him, Paladin refuses, and that sets Tracy off. He takes a swing at Paladin, but Paladin lands a single punch that leaves Tracy stunned on the sofa, and Ella very upset. Then Paladin leaves an envelope on the table and rides out of town. But Ella is impressed that Tracy was willing to fight for her. The envelope contains a note telling Tracy that he's a lucky man, and a chess piece for Ella, the same as the knight adorning Paladin's holster. The end.
Thank you so much, Earl, for that recap. Very good, very, very thorough, as always.
Thank you. I do try, and there's a lot happening, and I feel like this is almost a broken record because we say it so often on this show. There's a lot happening in 26 minutes here. Absolutely.
After I finished the episode, I looked over at my husband, who I, on podcasts like to affectionately refer to as Mr. Nerdy Blogger. Looked over at Mr. Nerdy Blogger and was like, I think I got whiplash watching that show. Definitely a lot going on for sure. I got thoughts about Ella.
I had a feeling you would. So it's lucky that the first show you're on, this is the one we're talking about. I had some thoughts too, but you know what? Line them up and knock them down. Let's hear what you thought.
First of all, way over the top. She goes from, as my southern vernacular would say, hooting and hollering at everybody, to cooling it down a little bit. Then she's crying. Then she's back to yelling again. Then she's calm and soft-spoken. It was a lot of emotions for 26 minutes.
Yeah, and it all happens very fast. And yes, the performances are kind of heightened, shall we say. Trying to find the best way to put that I can. And even for something that internally on the production may have been thought of as a comedy episode, that intro scene, the first we see of Ella, it's almost hard to take her seriously there.
Yes.
Because there is both rootin' and tootin' going on here in great amounts, and then she's got to bring it down and make this a real person. But wouldn't this have been a lot more interesting if she had been toned down and steely-eyed and dangerous, not unlike Paladin himself? when we met her, instead of shouting and shooting at people's feet.
I would have liked to have seen her as a more dangerous type figure for sure, versus, she was effectively female Yosemite Sam walking in to this episode.
I think perhaps all of the emotional shades that she is so good at showing later would have made more sense if the original formulation of the character that we got wasn't close to being a caricature.
Yes, caricature was definitely the word I was going to use there. I felt like I was watching a caricature of this type of character, like a Annie Oakley type character.
It's kind of interesting that you bring up Annie Oakley, because in regular mission log, covering various iterations of Star Trek, there's been the observation that the writers of Star Trek down through the years, down through the decades, have a tendency to group historical figures or historical events and one plot-relevant fictional thing, so you instantly place those things on an equal footing. Mm-hmm. And there's kind of a version of that here. It's a little bit clumsier, because Tomahawk Crutter says, when he's talking about Ella, she's already got more of a reputation than Calamity Jane, Cimarron Rose, and Belle Starr all lumped together. Annie Oakley's about the only person he doesn't mention in that rogues gallery, but you instantly have this context. It's like, okay, so that's who we're dealing with here.
Yeah. So you've already got this idea of who Ella's supposed to be, and I'm guessing she's supposed to be that type of figure in his Wild West show. I'll bring this up later in the episode, but I was trying to figure out, was her role, we've got a lady sharpshooter, we've got a lady who can rope and ride and is as rough and tough as any man, blah, blah, blah. So I was trying to figure out her role, but again, we've only got 26 minutes. But he also is like, you need to tame her? It's like, I thought she was like doing her thing for your show. I found that a little confusing. And again, this is probably related to the amount of time that we have in the TV show to be able to extrapolate on these things. But I just didn't feel like I had a really great context for what her role was in the Wild West show.
Yeah, and again, going back to that initial performance of the character, just one line thrown in there, like, could you stop playing your character for just a minute and take things seriously? That would have spelled out a whole lot right there.
Right.
But, you only have 26 minutes, and so sometimes that one line is one of the first things to get cut. We covered a while back an episode called The Hanging Cross, which was the Christmas episode. The Hanging Cross was obviously taking some cues from A Christmas Carol. Mm-hmm. And I felt like there was a lot of Pygmalion DNA. Pygmalion has been, I don't want to say plagiarized, it has inspired a lot of stories. Generally, whether you're talking about Pygmalion or anything else that it has inspired, there is almost always a young lady from a lower social class and some male character, your Professor Higgins proxy, has to teach her to behave and teach her how to talk, and usually how to speak the Queen's English, because it's almost always in a British or European setting.
Well, perhaps in the vein of Pygmalion inspired work, She's All That, 1999.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that is directly inspired by Pygmalion. So,
yeah,
a lot of people have made bacon out of his Pygmalion. Then we have this showdown with a character named Breed, who I don't believe we had met before. But all of a sudden, he's the heavy.
Was he in the first scene where Ella's in the lobby after shooting up the bar or something? I think he's in the background.
He may have been in the background. I don't think he had a single line of dialogue to point him up as this might be someone we hear from later.
I think he says, like, you just say the word and I'll do whatever.
Yeah. He's ready to do that again later in this scene in the tavern. And this is where we get the out-of-context opening line from the main titles, which that is a feature of Have Gun Will Travel, that we take a line of dialogue that's spoken later and take it out of context. And it's not like they're lifting that same audio. It's Richard Boone doing a completely different line reading on that same line of dialogue. This is the first time, to me, having watched several episodes of this before, this is the first time it has felt like that scene was in there just to give us a menacing opening line for the credits.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out, like, why is this even happening? Like, does she want him to shoot Tracy? She want him to shoot Paladin? Or this is my very first episode watching Have Gun Will Travel. So I found it a little, for want of a better word, confusing. Like, why is this here? Also, as somebody who loves whiskey, you could have just shot the glasses. That is a waste of perfectly good whiskey. Like, come on, dude. You could have just shot the glasses.
And that whole scene just doesn't add much to the story. And Breed really doesn't exist outside that scene. He disappears after that. Of course, we find out that he was basically let go over that confrontation. Right. But that whole thing just kind of makes it feel like that entire scene and Breed being there at all was, perhaps a late addition.
I think you might be right about that.
Something that wasn't in the original script. Again, with Have Gun, we are operating from the finished show as broadcast, and we don't have the original scripts to look at, and we don't have any kind of a paper trail of correspondence back and forth between writer and story editor or showrunner. But that scene seems so superfluous, it just feels like you could pluck it out and it wouldn't affect anything. The scene where Ella shows up in the dress, I have all sorts of thoughts about this. Boy, you talk about keeping romantic tension barely at arm's length. Paladin gets up from the sofa. Richard Boone has this almost pained expression on his face. And I think the script is clearly trying to draw attention to, okay, these two might actually be good together, but he is not going to do that. Yeah. Couple observations there. I kind of zeroed in on the dialogue. For those who don't know me personally, some context about myself is I do not check a lot of stereotypical lady boxes, up to and including shopping for dresses and dress clothes. So when she says, bought some female clothes that cost more than genuine buckskin, I laughed out loud because last week I legitimately bought some dressier clothes for some different things I've got going on, and I was like, this is more expensive than jeans and t-shirts. I don't know that I like this. But I found all of that. I was like, oh, that's still true today versus 1950s when this was written and the 1870s when this is set. And I was like, dang it. It's very, very expensive. I won't say that's my one silly aside because I have many other silly asides, but that was something that I found very resonant personally. And I guess the other silly aside was the pattern of the dress was almost exactly the same as the wallpaper. She kind of blended in. You're laughing. I'm really glad I'm not the only person that noticed that. It's the perfect camouflage. See, she is still thinking like a gunslinger.
Yes. There's a film I haven't seen, but was mentioned on another podcast I listened to about When a Stranger Calls 2 or something like that. And the stranger is hiding in the person's house because he painted himself the same color as the wall. And so he's just standing up against the wall. This could work. This could work.
Great planning. That's just great planning.
Yes to the tension in the room, for sure. The non-spoken words. But she says, Tracy was right. If I ain't a woman, I ain't nothing. I really struggled with that line. Because, I mean, even still today, your value as a woman is sometimes assigned to you, or at least in a lot of places in society, based on your appearance. Like, do you meet certain beauty standards? Do you dress a certain way? Are you a certain body type? You will be treated differently according to these things. And sometimes if you don't meet those standards, you are made to feel like you are not a woman, or you are less of a woman, or if I ain't a woman, I ain't nothing. And that one hurt.
Okay, so you're flagging that as a really good line.
It's a good line because it's true, and it's unfortunate, and I hate that it's true. I think it hit me both ways, like, dang, that's still true, because she's been made to feel like she is not a woman because she wears jeans and shoots guns and hollers and, is not quiet. But, as soon as she puts on a dress, Paladin notices her versus the way Paladin treats her when she's not dressed that way. There's a real dichotomy there. I felt rage is like, it's the same person. She is just presented differently.
Exactly. And I'm pretty sure she was a woman before she put on the dress.
Yeah. Turns out you don't have to wear a dress.
Who knew?
Shocking.
It's just kind of an interesting thing that we have this, and I don't know if it really lands as a period rom-com. This is not something that a whole lot of Westerns could necessarily do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big part of, whether we're talking about Gene scripts or not, this is a big part of why Have Gun Will Travel is remembered like it is, and is still talked about today. And I have a feeling that had a huge influence on Gene's construction of his own shows in the future, such as Star Trek, which doesn't always do comedy well, but the format allows for the attempt. It's not always going to take itself super seriously, and, we refuse to let you laugh at our characters. And I think Gene is learning some things. He is learning some things here to put to use in his future work. Mm-hmm. Okay, now here's another line. I'm Ella West, twice any man and 6 times any woman. And it really makes me think a big part of her issues that present in this story come from the fact that the worth that she has seen assigned to each gender as part of her socialization growing up. She was raised to think that she was less, and this led her to decide, you know what? Maybe I'm going to cast off the trappings of kind of the expected femininity that she would have been raised to display otherwise. Because if she has been raised in a household where men's labor, men's time, whatever, was always valued more, why wouldn't she want in on that?
Right.
Speaking of overvaluing one gender over another, now that it's common knowledge that there are more than 2 genders on the table, we all still need to work on not making this mistake.
Treat human beings with dignity. How about that?
It's amazing the results you get from that. All right, Ashley, we didn't even notice, or I didn't notice, until we ended the previous segment, that we had kind of mixed the funny ha-ha observations and just graduated into the serious stuff. And so it was kind of one big segment that was observations and discussion at the same time.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling we're going to still be discussing things running up to the wrap here, because there's stuff going on. I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about this episode, to be honest.
Yeah.
So, while I am processing that, why don't you tell us what you found here? That, first off, let me ask you this. Okay, you said this was the first Have Gun Will Travel you've ever watched.
Yes.
I don't know if this... I would be passing up a golden opportunity to not ask you this question in that light. Had you heard of the show prior to watching it?
Oh, definitely. My dad watches Westerns almost exclusively. So I feel fairly confident that, if he's not watching a John Wayne movie or a Sam Elliott in something of the like, he's watching an old Western TV show. I know he likes Bonanza and Gunsmoke. I feel fairly confident he's probably watched Have Gun Will Travel, but for me, Westerns were never my jam, really, with the exception of watching Briscoe County Jr. Growing up. That was like the one thing he and I would watch together. So this was my introduction to Have Gun Will Travel, other than listening to you and Norman talk about the show on Gene-ology. I found Paladin's characterization in this episode to be very confusing because he makes nice with Ella. Like he quotes, Yeats to her? Quotes poetry to her?
Yes.
And then he's like, you need a bath, or you need to find a man who likes the smell of a stable. I was like, what a jerk. How rude. Not friendly. And then, he goes from like trying to woo her, but then also insults her. I was like, having not read Pygmalion, I have to wonder, is this something that occurs in the story? Is this where we're taking this inspiration, or is this on par for Paladin, at least what we've seen thus far in the series? I know it's still season 1.
That's kind of an interesting question about how Paladin's characterization stacks up here versus previous episodes. We are at the end of Gene's involvement in the first season of the show, and of those 5 episodes, 4 of them came in a row right around the holidays. And there were funny ones, and there were serious ones, and there was a Christmas episode where, there was almost a massacre. So it's kind of hard to gauge, but there is this weird tug of war going on. A lot of push, a lot of pull. He's trying to build Ella up and then knock her down, which feels very much like it is hewing to the over-deployed masculinity script that Norm and I have mentioned in so many past editions of this podcast, where you don't show your feelings, man up, cowboy up, whatever the phrase is. It's a bad phrase in any application, and it's not something necessarily that really needs to be deployed in this situation. Now, it could be trying to, and this is not really something I do too often, but trying to get into Gene's head while he was writing this. Perhaps the thought was that this act of building someone up and then knocking them down and then urging them to get up again, perhaps Paladin is using that because in Gene's mind, as he was writing the script, he was thinking, well, Ella is basically casting herself as a man for much of this show, so she is going to be treated that way. But keep in mind what that translates to is how a man would have been treated in 1957 or 58, which, as we have often noted, is not necessarily in line with best practices for mental health.
Right.
It's weird. Paladin makes himself look absolutely awful at many points in this story, and it's really hard to reconcile. This is supposed to be our hero. What is he doing? And there really isn't much of a precedent that we've seen in the show to now for this episode. And so it really does stick out a bit.
My thought was, okay, if this guy's supposed to be our hero, our man of virtue, I mean, his name is Paladin, for goodness sakes. As a Dungeons and Dragons player, I can't, dissociate the name Paladin with, from a character who is on a type of holy quest. Is if that's who he's supposed to be, he's not doing it right. So I found that very frustrating that he would be kind and then cruel in the same breath. I found that very frustrating and very off-putting. So there's that. I want to talk a little more about Ella because, and you know, we've already touched on this a little bit, but the people seem confused about how to treat and interact with her. There is a line that Tracy says to her, "Thought there was still some woman left in those man's britches." I was like, come on, bro. Not cool. Not okay. And then later she says to Paladin, maybe I ain't a real woman. Honestly, there's a lot in Ella's struggle here that I actually found very relatable growing up as a girl who did not check stereotypical girl boxes. I played with action figures instead of Barbies. I wanted to wear jeans and go get in the mud and run around outside. My mom is a Mary Kay lady, and I barely know how to put on makeup, and I don't wear it that often. Unless unless it is required that I wear it, I'm not going to put it on. Because to me, like, that's just not who I am. So I found Ella very relatable for that reason. I, too, have also been accused of being a little bit over the top. So, but I can't say I've ever come busting in to a bar like Yosemite Sam. So there's that. Take that for what you will. So I found this struggle that she's having throughout this episode incredibly relatable because the men that she is trying to relate to, trying to be considered an equal to, they don't treat her with respect. Like, they say things like, "Oh, I thought there was still some woman left in those men's bridges, but maybe not." It makes her question her value as a human being because of how she's being treated. You know, she says, maybe I ain't a real woman. Paladin only treats her really with dignity once she gets all dressed up. You know, I wrote down the line, "You'd only need kindness if you had no virtues. And you have many. You have courage. A rare, honest kind of courage that lets you look in a mirror and change what you see there. You're a woman. You're a very attractive woman." And she says, "Don't say that to me for pity." And he says, "Pity is not included in the course, Ella. Smooch." Like, he only treats her with dignity, really, and acceptance when she's dressed in traditional feminine clothing. And she's had a bath. You know, she's all gussied up. I found it frustrating. Like, he says that she has courage, but she's courageous because she's changed her look, and that somehow makes her brave. Maybe other people can come in and explain this to me, but I've never understood why you should give more value to a person based on how they look and whether or not that is appealing to you.
Yeah, for all the poetry the Paladin quotes in this episode, he seems to be completely forgetting this above all, to thine own self be true. The frustrating thing is, he is doing this at someone else's request. No one is asking her what she wants.
Yes.
That bothered me. We're doing this because Tomahawk Crothers basically, and I believe it is put into exactly these words, he's asked Paladin to tame her. It just feels like perhaps the implications of that have not been fully thought out, or they've been thought out as much as they're going to be by a man from the 1950s. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which Gene was. And, you know, I try not to build Gene up. I try not to dogpile him. We're talking about the work, not the man. Like anyone else, he was a product of his times, and his worldview was evolving, and I don't think he had arrived at the place that he would eventually arrive, you know, somewhere during Star Trek, where women had more agency. Mm. Although not always the case in Star Trek, too.
Right.
But again, just hewing to this very shallow notion. And, you know, even the smooch that he plants on her bothered me a bit, because it's obvious that he understands she and him are not fated to be together. Why do that? I realize it's a cinematic convention.
Well, and the other thing I observed, and, you know, I am by no means a counselor or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, or anything like that. Ella has attachment issues.
Oh, yes, she does.
Because she was, it sounded, you know, based on what little bit we get, there's emotional abandonment, emotional absence from her folks growing up. The one person that she had like a good emotional connection to was Tracy. Tracy left, and that wasn't his fault. He was moving with his family when he was 16 or 18. She was 16. She felt loss because of that anchor, and so she has now attached herself to Paladin, who shows her kindness but then also pushes her away with his cruelty, and she keeps coming back for more because she has these attachment issues. You know, yes, it is a cinematic convention, but then you have later in the episode where he leaves a note and said, no, Tracy, you were here first, so you go ahead. You know, and it was fade to black. I mean, it's 1950s. I'm not going to assume that they had sex or whatever, but it felt like he took what he wanted from Ella and then left her because he had to move on. He had to extract his fee, which 10% of the proceeds from the season of the Wild West show? That seems a bit extravagant.
Well, and if you notice at the beginning of the episode, I think it's Tomahawk Carter is like, oh, you're still expensive, Paladin.
Yeah.
Skills do have value. Labor does have value. But
sure.
That's quite a ticket he's getting here. Okay, now, we took almost exactly the same note. What I wrote down was that when Ella talks about trying to get Tracy to help her escape her horrible situation when he and his family moved away, loads of red flags just went up in the distance. A person cannot be your escape from a bad situation.
No, they cannot.
It is very easy to see someone that way if they kick the door open for you, but you have got to be careful. Because even if that person gets you out of that bad situation, if they act like you owe them for that forever, hey, guess what? You're in a brand new bad situation, a new and exciting bad situation. Now, Tracy did not do that in this episode's backstory, but by believing that the solution to her bad situation is a person, throughout this episode it seems like Ella is setting herself up for a lifetime of bitter disappointment, or worse. Being taken advantage of in some way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where we find her here. A person can help you into a better situation than the one you're in. But a better situation looks like a better situation. It doesn't look like any one person. Young Tracy wasn't in a position to help young Ella out. He at least was honest about that.
Right.
You've got to watch out for the people who aren't as honest or honorable or compassionate. And this is kind of feeds back into my problem with the characterization of Paladin here. We talked about the kiss, and there's sort of an ambiguity there because we fade out on that kiss, and there is a passage of time. A passage of time that is left widely open to interpretation, which I was, wow, okay. It's lucky that the next guy that Ella finds herself attracted to is Paladin. As she says, an honorable man. But that scene where she breaks down in tears and promises him that if he gets her out of where she is now, her exact words, because I felt like I had to write this down, I could be just like you want. No,
yes.
no, that is not the answer. The problem with this episode, the big overriding problem, is that we're talking about Ella having courage in terms of changing herself. What about her having courage to be who she is meant to be. Maybe it's not the character we meet at the beginning of the episode, but maybe she is meant to be, a secret third thing that we haven't seen yet, but no one's encouraging that. Just get into that dress, honey. Everything will be better if you just tick off all the boxes for femininity in the 1950s or, in the 1870s or what have you. Okay, we've done 34 of these. That is about the most un-Roddenberry message I have run across yet on this show.
Well, and it's not even you have to change to be accepted. It's like if you are a woman, you must change to conform to this idea to be accepted. Because,
right.
I mean, how many male protagonists or antagonists are still allowed to be Yosemite Sam or be whoever, but maybe they're a little nicer now. I found that very frustrating as someone who's often been told, well, you would be prettier if you did this. You should dress like this because people will perceive you differently. And I'm the kind of person who I don't know how to be anybody else but me. I like what I like. 95% of my interests make me the only lady in the room, and that's fine by me. I've come to accept that. I don't know how to do stereotypical girl things because those are not my cup of tea. I'm very thankful that I have lots of wonderful people in my life who that don't bother them at all. The society in which I grew up, so much of that, that was the feedback I got. Oh, you should do this or you should do X, Y, Z, and I've just said, nope, this is what you get.
Yeah, wow. Trying to figure out the message that's there and then finding out it's this. This is the first Have Gun you've watched. I'm going to say that of the 5 that I have reviewed so far for this podcast, this one I think may have just hit the new bottom slot. It may have just bumped everything else up by default, because if that's the message, it's a terrible, terrible message. And it just feels like maybe we started out, why don't we do a Pygmalion episode? And okay, we'll do that, but then we didn't think about the implications of the setting. And it just didn't get thought out. Pygmalion itself happens in obviously a very different setting from this. It's not a Western. While Have Gun Will Travel is a very flexible format, maybe Pygmalion wasn't the best thing to try to jam into that format because it got us here.
Yeah. I'd like to bring up just a couple things. One, this idea of Ella as property. Paladin leaves the note for Tracy. It says, I had first claim on you. Okay. Does Ella not have a say in this? So that there's that idea. But then the conversation that Paladin has with Tom at the end, like, he says, you'll have a double attraction from now on. And I was like, is the double attraction a woman who dresses and hollers and shoots like a man, but is actually also a pretty woman? Is this the double attraction? Like, is she going to ride out and, hog tie a pig and then, ride off and then come back out sporting a dress? Like, is this the double attraction? I found that line very confusing because of the implication there. That, I guess maybe he's trying to say, get you a girl who can do both in a generous way. I don't know. I found that confusing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
You see, I took that to mean that perhaps she and Tracy would be a double bill of some kind.
Yeah.
Like they would be part of the same act.
I wondered if it was that as well.
Your read on that just completely brought me up short, because it's like, oh no, I hope that's not what we meant here.
Yeah, and maybe because we get a kind of a clear idea of what Tracy does. Like Paladin says at the beginning of the episode he saw him ride, and so I'm assuming he's a bull rider or a bronc buster. Was one of the things listed on the poster that he was hiring for. So I'm assuming he does something like that. And so Ella, I guess, is the Calamity Jane, Annie Oakley type character. So basically, it's a girl who can do cowboy things. Again, maybe that's the double act they're referring to, because I wondered if it was that, or is Paladin saying, oh, no, now you got you a girl who can do both.
And this brings up a new unsettling thing for me. It seems like, we want her to change when she's not on the job, but we still want to be able to exploit this kind of Annie Oakley-esque character. Again, the heart of the story, the heart of what I'm having a problem with here, no one's asking her.
Right.
At any point. No one's asking her what she wants. It's just, please do what we want. And that will make our lives so much easier. Well, good for them, but no one's asking her.
Yeah. I had first claim on you. Yeah, I obviously she's into Tracy, but she was also smooching with Paladin the night before, so for me, this episode was lots of mixed messages. I found it a little bit confusing, obviously, as I've stated now for the past hour. and also, I mean, again, I have to take into consideration when this was released, there was this very rigid idea of how women should do and be. And I'm like, thank God I was born in the 80s. Like, I would not have survived. Because if this is the messaging I'm getting in my TV, then I'm going to feel pretty out of place.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, the hanging of Roy Carter.
Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takachi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.